Munich, by Robert Harris. Hartmann was certain from the moment he left the hotel that he was being followed. He had an animal's sixth sense, a kind of prickling along his spine, of being stalked by a predator. But there were too many people around to be able to recognize his pursuer. The small park opposite the Regina Palace was spilling over with the Oktoberfest crowd. The night was warm enough for women still to be wearing dresses with bare arms. A lot of the men were drunk. In Karolinenplatz an impromptu folk choir had formed beneath the obelisk, and a red-faced man with a chamois plume in his hat was waving his hands wildly in an attempt to conduct them. He walked quickly. The fools, he thought. They imagined they were celebrating peace. They had no idea what their beloved Führer had planned for them. When a couple of young women on Breinerstrasse suddenly blocked his path and invited him to join them, he pushed his way past without a word. They jeered at his back. He put his head down. Fools! And the greatest fool of all was Chamberlain. He stopped beneath a bare tree to light a cigarette and discreetly checked the road behind him. He allowed himself a certain bitter satisfaction. When all was said and done, he'd at least got to deliver his warning to the British Prime Minister. That was something. He could still see the affronted expression on that narrow provincial face when he'd refused to take back the memorandum. Poor Hugh, standing next to him, had looked stricken. Perhaps he'd ruined his career. Too bad. It could not be helped. But still he felt a pang of guilt. He glanced over his shoulder again. A figure was approaching. Despite the heat, he was wearing a belted brown raincoat. As he passed, Hartmann had a glimpse of a badly pockmarked cheek. Gestapo, he thought. They had their own smell. And they were like rats. If there was one, there would be more. So he waited until the man reached the edge of the Königsplatz and passed out of sight beyond one of the temples of honour. Then he threw away his cigarette and set off in the direction of the Führerbau. The crowd here was much larger, several thousand at least, but more sober, as befitted their proximity to the spiritual heart of the Reich. Hartmann climbed the red-carpeted steps and went into the foyer. As it had been in the morning, it was packed with Nazi worthies. The din of braying voices echoed off the marble. He searched for porcine faces of the old comrades and the smoother, educated countenances of those who'd joined the party since 1933, until he thought he saw the pockmarks of his pursuer. But when he moved towards him, the Gestapo man vanished into the cloakroom. The sheer clumsiness of it infuriated him as much as anything else. He went to the foot of the staircase and waited. Sure enough, after a few minutes, the black-uniformed figure of Sauer came through the door. Hartmann moved to block his path. "Good evening, Sturmbannführer." Sauer nodded warily. "Hartmann? I have missed you for most of the day." "Indeed. You know, I have the strangest feeling. Perhaps you can set my mind at rest. But I have a sense that you have been following me." For a moment Sauer looked taken aback. Then outrage flashed across his face. "You've got some nerve, Hartmann." "Well, have you?" "Yes. Since you raised the matter, I have been investigating your activities." "It's not a very comradely thing to do." "I have every justification. As a result, I now know all about you and your English friend." "I presume you mean Herr Legat." "Legat, yes, Legat. We were at Oxford together." "I know that. From 1930 until 1932. I have spoken to the personnel department of the Foreign Ministry. I've also contacted our embassy in London, who were able to establish that Legat and you were actually in the same cottage." "Well, if you'd asked me, I would have saved you the trouble." "It amounts to nothing." "If that was all there was, I might agree. But I have discovered that Herr Legat was not on the original list of British delegates that was telegraphed to Berlin last night. His name was only added this morning. A colleague of his, a Herr Sears, he was supposed to have been coming." Hartmann tried not to show his alarm. "I failed to see the significance." "Your behaviour at the station at Kufstein. Telephoning Berlin to discover who would be coming from London. It struck me at the time as suspicious. Why would you be so concerned? Why were you even on board the Führer's train in the first place? I now believe it was because you requested that Legat should come to Munich, and you wanted to make sure that he was on Chamberlain's plane." "You overestimate my influence, Sturmbannführer." "I'm not suggesting you arranged it personally. Some member of your group would have made a request on your behalf. Oh, yes, your group. Don't look surprised. We're well aware of what is going on. We are not the fools you take us for. I should hope not. And now you have been observed leaving the Führerbau by a back entrance in order to walk to the hotel of the British delegation, where I saw you in the lobby with my own eyes in conversation with Herr Legget before disappearing together upstairs. The whole thing stinks of treachery. Two old friends happen to meet after a long interval. They take advantage of a lull in official business to renew their acquaintance. Where is evidence of treachery? You're embarrassing yourself, Sturmbannführer. The English are inherently hostile to the Reich. Unauthorized contacts between officials are highly suspicious. I've been doing nothing more than the Führer has been doing with Herr Chamberlain all afternoon, finding areas of common ground. For a moment it occurred to Hartmann that Sauer was about to hit him. We will see whether you're so sure of yourself after I have brought the matter to the attention of a foreign minister. Hartmann! The shout carried clearly over the hubbub in the fire. Both men looked round to see where it was coming from. Hartmann! He glanced up. Schmidt was leaning over the balustrade, gesturing for him to join him. Excuse me, Sturmbannführer. I'll wait to hear from you and the minister. You will! You can be sure of it! Hartmann began to climb the stairs. His legs felt weak. He ran his hand up the cold marble banister, glad of its support. He had been careless. The former automobile salesman from Essen was proving a dogged adversary, and no fool. There must be so many pieces of circumstantial evidence he'd left behind him. Unguarded conversations, meetings that might have been observed, and his relationship with Frau Wenter. How many people in Wilhelmstrasse had guessed at that? He wondered how robustly he could withstand interrogation. One never knew. Schmidt was waiting for him on the first floor. He looked crumpled. The effort of interpreting between 4 different languages and of simply maintaining order long enough for his translations to be heard had obviously drained him. He said testily, I've been looking for you. Where have you been? When the British raised a query about one of the translations, I went to their hotel to sort it out of them directly. Another lie that could easily come back to trap him. But for now it seemed to satisfy Schmidt. Good. The agreements are still being typed. When the delegations return to the signing, you will have to be on hand to translate. Of course. Also, first thing tomorrow morning you will be needed back here to prepare the English-language press summary for the Führer. The telegrams will be collated in the office. You'll need to get some sleep if you can. I think there is a room for you. Hartmann could not hide his alarm. Now that we're no longer on the train, I thought the summary would be handled by the press department. Normally, yes, so you should be honoured. The Führer himself has requested that you should do it. You seem to have made an impression. He called you the young man with the watch. In the lobby of the Regina Palace, the Prime Minister's party was queuing to file out through the revolving door. Chamberlain was already on the pavement. Legget could hear the crowd in the park cheering him. Strang said, I haven't seen you for a while. I was starting to think you decided to sit this one out. No, sir, my apologies. Not that I'd have blamed you. I wouldn't have minded missing it myself. They went out into the tumult of the night, the revving engines of the big Mercedes, car doors slamming along the length of the convoy, shouts, white flashbulbs, red brake lights, and yellow headlights. Somewhere in the darkness a whistle blew. For more than an hour Legget had been expecting the blow to fall. He'd sat in the corner office dictating to a clerk in the Foreign Office the latest amendments to the agreement, his ears cocked for voices in the corridor, waiting for the summons, the dressing down, the dismissal. Nothing. Now Wilson was settling the Prime Minister into the back of the first car. When he'd finished, he swung round. He noticed Legget. This must be it, thought Legget, and he braced himself. But Wilson merely grinned. Hello, you. Coming to witness history being made? Yes, Sir Horace, if that's all right. Of course it's all right. Legget watched him move quickly round to the other side of the car. His friendliness was bewildering. Strang said, Come on, you look lively. Why don't you ride with me? They climbed into the third Mercedes. Henderson and Kirkpatrick were in the car in front, Ashton Watkin and Dunglass the rear. When they pulled away and cornered sharply with a soft squeal of tyres, Leggett noticed that Strang didn't sway with the motion of the car, but remained stiff and immobile. He was hating every moment. The convoy accelerated along Max Josefstrasse and along Karolinenplatz, the wind hard in their faces. Leggett wondered if he would see Hartmann at Furibau. He didn't resent him for embarrassing him in front of his Prime Minister. It had been a futile gesture, of course, but then they were trapped in an era where futile gestures were all that were available. Paul had got it right that night when he stood on the parapet at Magdalen Bridge. Ours is a mad generation. Their destinies had been mapped from the moment they met. The convoy came into Königsplatz. It looked even more pagan in the darkness, its giant symbols and eternal flames and floodlit white buildings glittering around a vast expanse of black granite like the temple complex of some lost civilization. By the time their car drew to a halt, the Prime Minister was already out of his Mercedes and halfway up the steps to the Furibau. He was in such a hurry that for once he didn't stop to acknowledge the large crowd, even though they were chanting his name. They carried on cheering after he disappeared inside, and Strang said, "What an astonishing reception he gets wherever he goes in Germany. It was exactly the same in Godesberg. I'm beginning to think that if he could stand for election, he'd give Hitler a run for his money." An SS man stepped up and opened the door. Strang shuddered slightly. Let's get it over with." The foyer was packed and brilliantly lit. Adjutants in white jackets circulated with trays of drinks. Strang went off to find Malkin. Left to himself, Leggett wandered around, holding a glass of mineral water, keeping an eye out for Hartmann. He saw Danglas making his way towards him. "Hello, Alec." "You. Some of our press chaps outside are complaining. Apparently no one from a British paper is to be allowed in to take a picture of the actual signing. I was wondering if you could possibly ask if something might be done about it." "Yes, of course I can try." "Could you? Best to keep them happy." He disappeared into the crowd. Leggett handed his glass to a waiter and began to climb the stairs. He paused halfway up and gazed around the balustraded gallery, unsure who to approach. One of the uniformed figures, an officer of the SS, detached himself from the rest and descended to meet him. "Good evening. You look lost." He spoke in German. There was a strange dead fish quality about his pale blue eyes. "Can I help you?" "Thank you, yes. I wanted to talk to someone about the press arrangements for the signing of the agreement." "Of course. Come with me, please." He gestured for Leggett to walk with him to the first floor. "There is an official of the Foreign Ministry who is doing much of the liaison work with our British guests." He led him around to the seating area at the front of the building where Hartmann was standing beside one of the pillars. "You know Herr Hartmann, perhaps?" Leggett pretended not to have heard. "Herr Leggett," repeated the SS man, his voice louder, less friendly. "I have asked your question. Do you know Herr Hartmann?" "I don't believe—" Hartmann cut in. "My dear Hugh, I think that Sturmbannführer Sauer is having a little joke with you. He knows perfectly well that we're old friends and that I came to see you in your hotel this evening. He knows it because he and his friends in the Gestapo followed me there." Leggett managed to smile. "Well, there is your answer. We've known each other for many years. Why do you ask? Is there a problem?" "You replaced a colleague on Herr Chamberlain's plane at the last minute, I believe." "Yes, that's right." "Might I ask why?" "Because I speak German better than he does." "Surely that was known from the start." "Everything was a bit last minute." "And there are people from your embassy in Berlin who can act as translators." Hartmann said, "Really, Sauer, I don't think you have the right to cross-examine a man who is a guest in our country." Sauer ignored him. "And before today you and Hartmann last met when, may I ask?" 6 years ago. Not that it's any of your business." "Good." Sauer nodded. Suddenly his confidence seemed to be running out. "Well, I shall leave you to talk. No doubt Hartmann will tell you everything you want to know." He clicked his heels, bowed slightly, and walked away. That was ominous. Take no notice of him. He's determined to expose me. He will keep digging until he finds something, but he hasn't got anything yet. Now we must assume we are being watched, so we must play our parts. What is it you want to know? Can the British press send in a photographer to record the signing? Who should I ask? Oh, don't bother, it's already been decided. The only camera permitted in the room will belong to the Führer's personal photographer Hoffmann, whose assistant, Fräulein Braun, so rumour has it, our not-so-celibate leader, is fucking. He put his hand on Leggett's shoulder and said quietly, I apologize if my actions tonight embarrassed you. Think nothing of it. I'm only sorry it wasn't more fruitful. He touched the front of his inside pocket where the memorandum was folded into 3. What would you like me to do with it? Keep it. Hide it in your room. Take it back with you to London. Make sure it reaches a more responsive audience. Hartmann squeezed his shoulder and released it. Now, for both our sakes, we should stop talking and move apart. I'm afraid it will be better if we do not speak again. Another hour dragged by. Leggett waited in the British delegation's room with the others while the documents were finalised. Nobody spoke much. He kept to himself in the corner. He found to his surprise that he could contemplate the imminent wreckage of his career with equanimity. No doubt this was the anaesthetic of tiredness. He was sure that when he got back to London he would feel differently. But for now he was sanguine. He tried to imagine telling Pamela that her dreams of becoming the chatelaine of a Paris embassy were no longer feasible. Perhaps he would leave the diplomatic service altogether. His father had once offered to help him find a nice little berth in the city. Maybe he should take him up on it. It would solve their financial worries, at least until the war came. It was midnight when Dunglass finally put his head round the door. The agreement's about to be signed. The PM wants everyone to be there. Leggett would have preferred not to attend, but there was no escape. He rose wearily from his chair and walked with his colleagues along the corridor towards Hitler's study. At the door of the big office a crowd of minor players, aides, adjutants, civil servants, Nazi party officials, had gathered. They parted to let them through. Inside, the heavy green velvet curtains had all been drawn, but the windows must have been opened, because Leggett could hear the movement of the crowd outside quite distinctly, like a gently moving sea, occasionally ruffled by eddies of shouts and singing. The room was packed. At the opposite end, standing around the desk, were Hitler, Goering, Himmler, Hess, Ribbentrop, Mussolini, and Chiano. They were studying a map, not seriously, it seemed to him, but for the benefit of a photographer using a handheld newsreel camera. He filmed them first from one side, then scampered round to do the same from the front, while Chamberlain and Daladier watched the proceedings from the hearth. All eyes were on Hitler. He was the only one talking. Occasionally he pointed and made sweeping gestures. Finally he folded his arms and stepped back, and the filming ended. There was no sound recording equipment, Leggett noticed. It was like watching the making of some strange, silent movie. He glanced at Chamberlain. The Prime Minister seemed to have been waiting for his opportunity. He left Wilson and went forward and spoke to Hitler, who listened to the translation, nodded vigorously a couple of times, and Leggett heard the famous harsh voice, "Ja, ja." The exchange lasted less than a minute. The Prime Minister returned to the fireplace. He looked pleased with himself. For an instant his gaze rested on Leggett, then almost immediately switched away to Mussolini, who had come over to talk to him. Goering waddled around, rubbing his hands. Himmler's round, rimless spectacles flashed in the light of a chandelier like two blind discs. After another minute or two, a small procession of officials entered, carrying the various documents that made up the agreement. At the back of the group was Hartmann. Leggett noticed how carefully he avoided looking at anyone. The map was rolled up and removed from the desk, and the papers were laid out. The photographer, a thick-set man of about 50 with wavy hair, Hoffmann presumably, gestured for the leaders to stand together. They grouped themselves awkwardly with their backs to the fireplace, Chamberlain on the left in his pinstriped suit with his watch chain and high-winged collar, like a waxwork in a museum of Victoriana. Daladier next to him, mournful, also pinstriped, but smaller, and with a protruding stomach. Then Hitler, impassive, pasty-faced and dead-eyed, with his hands folded together over his crutch. And at the end Mussolini, a brooding expression on his large, fleshy face. The silence was palpable, as if nobody wished to be there, like guests at an arranged wedding. The moment the photograph was taken, the group broke up. Ribbentrop indicated the desk, and Hitler went over to it. A young SS adjutant handed him a pair of spectacles. They changed his face in an instant, made him look fussy and pedantic. He peered down at the document. The adjutant gave him a pen. He dipped it into the inkstand, examined the nib, frowned, straightened, and pointed irritably. The inkstand was empty. There was an uneasy shifting in the room. Goering rubbed his hands together and laughed. One of the officials pulled out his own fountain pen and gave it to Hitler. Again he bent forward and studied the paper carefully. Then, very quickly, scribbled his signature. One aide rolled a curved blotter over the wet ink, then a second lifted away the document, and a third slid another sheet of paper in front of Hitler. He scribbled again. The same procedure was repeated. It went on for several minutes, 20 times in all. A copy of a main agreement for each of the four powers, along with the various annexes and supplementary declarations. The fruit of some of the most creative legal brains in Europe, which had enabled them to slide over matters of contention, postpone them for later haggling, and reach a settlement in less than 12 hours. When Hitler had finished, he tossed the fountain pen casually on the desk and turned away. Chamberlain was the next to step up to the desk. He too put on a pair of spectacles, which he was as reluctant as the Führer to be seen wearing in public, took out his pen and scrutinized what he was about to sign. His jaw worked slightly back and forth, and then carefully he wrote out his name. From outside came a burst of cheering, as if the crowd knew what was happening at that moment. Chamberlain was too absorbed to react, but Hitler grimaced and gestured to the window, and an adjutant parted the curtains and closed the sash. In the shadows at the back of the study, Hartmann watched it all without seeing, his long face blank and ashy with exhaustion. Like a ghost, thought Leggett, like a man already dead. Day 4. In the bedroom of the Regina Palast Hotel, Hugh Leggett was asleep. He was splayed out on his back, fully clothed and unconscious, his head lolling to one side, like a drowned man fished out of the sea. The light was still on in the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. The room was cast in a pale bluish light. At one time there had been voices in the corridor outside. He'd recognised Strang, then Ashton Watkin, and footsteps. But the Prime Minister had at last gone to bed, and gradually these extraneous sounds had ceased, and now there was only the rhythm of his breathing and his occasional muttered cry. He dreamed that he was flying. He was too deeply asleep to hear the noise of his door handle being tried. What woke him was the tapping. It was soft at first, more like a scratching of fingernails on wood, and when he opened his eyes, he assumed it was one of the children trying to clamber into their bed after a nightmare. But then he saw the unfamiliar room and remembered where he was. He squinted at the luminous hands on the hotel's alarm clock. 3:30. The noise came again. He reached out and turned on the bedside lamp. The memorandum lay on the nightstand. He rolled off the bed, opened the drawer of the desk, and inserted it into the hotel's guide to Munich. The floor creaked as he crossed to the door. He touched the handle, but at the last moment some instinct warned him not to turn it. "Who's there?" "It's Paul." The German loomed on the threshold, absurd in his conspicuousness. Leggett pulled him into the room and glanced quickly up and down the corridor. Nobody was stirring. The detective must be spending the night in the Prime Minister's sitting room. He closed the door. Hartmann was going round the bedroom collecting Leggett's overcoat, hat and shoes. "Put these on." "What on earth for?" "Quickly, I want to show you something." "Are you mad? At this hour? It's the only time we have." Leggett was still half asleep. He rubbed his face and shook his head in an effort to wake himself fully. "What is it you want me to say? If I tell you that, you won't come." In his determination he seemed almost demented. He held out the shoes. "Please." "Paul, this is dangerous." "Ha!" He gave a short bark of laughter. "Do you think you have to point that out to me?" He threw the shoes on the bed. "I shall be at the back of a hotel. I shall wait for you outside. If you're not there in 10 minutes, I shall know you're not coming." After he'd gone, Leggett paced up and down the small room for a minute. The situation was so preposterous he could almost believe he'd dreamed the whole thing. He sat on the edge of a mattress and picked up his shoes. He'd been too tired to take them off properly before he went to sleep. Now he found he couldn't unpick the laces, even with his teeth. He had to stand and kick his toes into the shoes and lever in the heels of his fingers. He felt angry. He was almost, he would admit it to himself, frightened. He put on his hat and draped the coat over his arm. He went out into the corridor and locked the door behind him, turned left and walked quickly round the corner towards the rear staircase. At the bottom he passed the entrance to the Turkish baths. A moist aroma of steam and sweet oils briefly released memories of gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall. And then he was out through the glass doors and into the small street at the back of a hotel. Hartmann was smoking a cigarette, leaning against the bodywork of one of the open-topped black Mercedes they'd been driving around in all day. The engine was ticking over. He grinned when he saw Leggett, dropped the cigarette into the gutter and ground it out of the toe of his shoe. He opened the front passenger door like a chauffeur. A minute later they were driving down a wide boulevard of shops and apartment blocks. The breeze was still warm. A swastika pennant fluttered on the bonnet. Hartmann didn't speak. He was concentrating on the road. His face in profile with its high forehead and Roman nose was imperious. Every few seconds he checked the mirrors. His anxiety transferred itself to Leggett. "Is there anyone behind us?" "I don't think so. Will you look?" Leggett twisted round in his seat. The road was empty. A gibbous moon had come up, and the tarmac was like a canal, flat and silvery. A few of the shop windows were lit. He had no idea of the direction they were travelling. He turned back to the windscreen. The car was slowing for an intersection. A couple of patrolling policemen in their bucket-shaped helmets stood on the corner. Their heads followed the Mercedes as he approached. When they saw the official pennant, they saluted. Hartmann looked at Leggett and laughed at the absurdity of it, showing his large teeth, and for a second time it struck Leggett that he was not entirely sane. "How did you get hold of the car?" "I gave the driver 100 marks to borrow it. I said I needed it to meet a girl." The city centre had dwindled into suburbs and factories. Across the dark fields Leggett could see the fires of furnaces and chimneys, scarlet, yellow, white. For a while a railway track ran along the centre of the autobahn. Then the road narrowed and they were in open country. It reminded Leggett of the drive from Oxford up to Woodstock and the pub they used to go to there. What was it? The Black Prince. After 10 minutes he could no longer keep his alarm to himself. "Is it much further? I shall need to get back to the hotel soon. The PM is an early riser." "It's not that far." "Don't worry. I'll get you back before morning." They passed through a small Bavarian town, entirely shuttered and asleep, and presently entered the outskirts of a second. This too appeared entirely normal. Whitewashed, half-timbered walls, steep red-tiled roofs, a butcher's shop, an inn, a garage. Then Leggett caught sight of a place name, Dachau, and he knew why he had been brought out here. He felt obscurely disappointed. So this was it. Hartmann drove carefully through the empty streets until they were on the edge of the town. He pulled up at the side of a road, turned off the engine and doused the headlights. To the right was woodland. The concentration camp was on the left, clearly visible against the moonlit sky. A high barbed wire fence stretching as far as Leggett could see, with watchtowers, and behind them the low outlines of barracks. The barking of guard dogs carried on the still air. A searchlight mounted on one of the towers prodded ceaselessly across a vast parade ground. It was the immensity of it that was most shocking. A captive town within a town. Hartmann was studying him. "You know what this is, I take it?" "Of course. It's been reported often enough in the press. There's been regular demonstrations against the Nazi repressions in London." "You didn't join them, I suppose?" "You know very well I couldn't. I'm a civil servant. We are politically neutral." "Naturally." "Oh, for Christ's sake, Paul, don't be so bloody naive." It was the obviousness of it he found most insulting. "Stalin has vastly bigger camps, where people are treated even worse. Do you want us to go to war with the Soviet Union as well?" "I merely point out that some of the people transferred into Germany by the agreement today may very well end up here by the end of the year." "Yes, and no doubt they would have ended up here in any case, assuming they hadn't been killed in the bombing. Not if Hitler had been deposed. If. It's always if. Their raised voices had been noticed. Beyond the wire, a guard with an Alsatian dog on a short leash started shouting at them. The probing finger of the searchlight swung across the parade ground, over the fence and onto the road. It advanced towards them. Suddenly the car was filled with brilliant, blinding light. Hartmann swore. He switched on the engine and found reverse gear. He looked over his shoulder, one hand on the steering wheel, and they backed away at speed, swerving from side to side down the middle of the road until they reached a side street. He put the Mercedes into first gear, swung the wheel, and they made a U-turn, sending up a spurt of dust and smoking rubber. The acceleration as they pulled away threw Leggett back in his seat. When he checked behind him, the searchlight was still weaving back and forth across the road, blindly searching. He said furiously, "That was a bloody stupid thing to do. Can you imagine the row if a British diplomat was arrested out here? I want to go back to Munich, now." Hartmann continued to stare ahead and didn't answer. "Did you really drag me all the way out here just to make a point?" "No. It happened to be on the way." "On the way? To what?" "Lena." So then, at last, Lena. She had wanted to set eyes on Hitler, not to hear him speak. She declared herself a communist. That would have been unthinkable. But just to see him in the flesh, this half-sinister, half-comical brawler and dreamer, whose party only 4 years earlier had come 9th in the elections with less than 3% of the vote, but who now was on the brink of becoming Chancellor. Most nights during the campaign, after addressing one of the huge rallies, he returned to the city. Everybody knew the address of his apartment. Her proposal was that they should go and stand outside in the hope they'd catch a glimpse of him. Hartmann had been against it from the start. He'd called it a waste of a good day, a trivial bourgeois diversion. Isn't that what you people call it? To focus upon an individual rather upon the social forces that had created them. But there was more to his reluctance than that. Leggett had realized afterwards. Hartmann knew what she was like, the sort of recklessness of which she was capable. She had appealed to Leggett to use his casting vote in her favour, and of course he had done so, partly because he was curious to see Hitler himself, but chiefly because he was half in love with her, a fact of which all three were aware. They treated it as a joke, himself included. He was so much less experienced and worldly than Hartmann, still a virgin at 21. And so, after their picnic on the grass in Koningsplatz, they had set off. It was the first week of July, just after midday, very hot. She was wearing one of Hartmann's white shirts with the sleeves rolled up, a pair of shorts and walking boots. Her limbs were brown from the sun. It was more than a mile away, through the centre of the city. The buildings shimmered like fantasies in the haze of heat. As they passed the southern end of the Englister garden, Hartmann had suggested they go swimming in the ice-back instead. Leggett had been tempted, but Lena would not be put off. On they went. The apartment was at the top of a hill, facing on to Prinzengensinsplatz, a busy, drearily impressive, half-cobbled square through which trams ran. By the time they reached it, they were sweating and bad-tempered. Hartmann was hanging back in a sulk, and Lena had decided to goad him further by pretending to flirt with Leggett. The building in which Hitler lived was a luxurious turn-of-the-century block with a hint of a French chateau about it. Outside it a gang of about a dozen stormtroopers were loitering, closing off that portion of the pavement, obliging pedestrians to step into the road and walk around the Führer's six-wheeled Mercedes, which was drawn up waiting for him. Across the street, no more than 20 yards away, a small crowd of curious spectators had gathered. So he was in residence, Leggett remembered thinking. And not only that, it looked as though he was about to leave. He asked, "Which is his apartment?" "Second floor," she pointed. A balcony ran between two bays with French windows. It was solid, heavy masonry. "Sometimes he comes out to show himself to the crowd. Of course this is the place where his niece was shot last year." As she delivered the last sentence, her voice rose slightly. A couple of people turned to look at her. "Well, they lived together, didn't they? What do you think, Polly? Gélie Robal, did she kill herself, or was she bumped off because of the scandal? When Hartman didn't reply, she said to Leggett, The poor kid was only 23. Everyone knew her uncle was fucking her. A middle-aged woman standing nearby turned and glared at her. You should shut your filthy mouth! Across the street the brown shirts were coming to attention, forming themselves into an honour guard between the door of the apartment building and the car. The crowd shuffled forwards. The door opened. Hitler appeared. He was wearing a dark blue double-breasted suit. Later, Leggett decided he must have been on his way to lunch. Some of the onlookers cheered and clapped. Lena cupped her hands to her mouth and yelled, Nice, fucker! Hitler glanced over at the small throng. He must have heard. The stormtroopers certainly had. Their heads had all swung in their direction. But just to make sure, she repeated it. You fucked your niece, you murderer! His face was expressionless. As he climbed into his car, a couple of the SA men broke ranks and started coming towards her. They had short truncheons. Hartman grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her after him. The woman who'd told her to shut her filthy mouth tried to block her path. Leggett pushed her out of the way. A man, a big fellow, her husband presumably, swung a punch and caught Leggett just below the eye. The three of them ran out of the square and down a leafy residential road. Hartman and Lena were in front of him. Leggett could hear the boots of the brown shirts thumping on the cobbles very close behind. His eye was stinging and already beginning to close. His lungs were searing as if they'd been pumped full of liquid ice. He remembered feeling both terrified and entirely calm. When a side road appeared to the right and Hartman and Lena ran straight past it, he swung down it, between big villas with front gardens. Presently he became aware the stormtroopers were no longer pursuing him. He was alone. He leaned on a small wooden gate to recover his breath, gasping and laughing. He felt almost ecstatically happy, as if he'd taken a drug. Later, when he got back to the hostel, he found Lena sitting in the courtyard with her back to the wall. Her face was turned to the sun. She opened her eyes and scrambled to her feet as soon as she saw him and hugged him. How was he? He was fine, better than fine, actually. Where was Paul? She didn't know. Once the fascists had given up chase and they were safe, he'd shouted at her, and she'd shouted back, and then he'd walked off. She inspected his eye and insisted on taking him upstairs to his bedroom. While he lay on the bed, she soaked a hand towel in the basin and folded it into a compress. She sat on the mattress beside him and held it to his eye. Her hip was pressed against him. He could feel the hardness of her muscle beneath the flesh. He'd never felt more alive. He reached his hand up behind her head and laced her hair between his fingers and pulled her face down to his and kissed her. She resisted for a moment, then kissed back and swung astride him, unbuttoning his shirt. Hartman didn't come back all that night. The next morning, Leggett had left his share of the bill on the dresser and slipped away. Within an hour he was on the earliest train out of the city. And that had been the only great adventure in the carefully planned life of Hugh Alexander Leggett, ex-Balliol College, Oxford, and third secretary in His Majesty's diplomatic service. Until this night. They motored on in silence along the narrow country roads for the best part of an hour. It was colder now. Leggett kept his hands in his coat pockets. He wondered where he was being taken, what he should say when he arrived. To this day he had no idea whether Hartman knew about his act of betrayal. He'd always assumed he must have done. Why else would he never have got in touch all the years since? He'd also written to Lena 2 letters full of love and remorse and pompous moral lectures. In retrospect he was glad they'd both been returned unopened. Finally they turned off onto a long drive. The headlights picked out neatly trimmed grass verges and low iron railings. Ahead was the shape of a large house, a manor house it would have been in England, without buildings. In a small round window beneath the eaves a solitary light was burning. They passed through an arched gateway and pulled up on a cobbled forecourt. Hartman switched off the engine. "Wait here." Leggett watched him walk towards the door. The front of the house was covered by ivy. In the moonlight he could now see that the upper windows were barred. He had a sudden presentiment of horror. Hartman must have rung a bell, For a moment later a light went on above the door. It was opened from the inside, a cautious crack at first, and then wider, so that Leggett could see a young woman in a nurse's uniform. Hartman said something to her, gestured to the car. She leaned around him to look. There was a discussion. Hartman raised his hands a couple of times, making some point or other, and at last she nodded. Hartman touched her on the arm and beckoned to Leggett to join them. The hall smelled of overcooked food and disinfectant. Leggett registered the details as he passed them. The carved Madonna above the door, the notice board covered in green baize and studded with pins, but with no notices, the wheelchair at the bottom of the staircase, a pair of crutches beside it. He followed Hartman and the nurse up to the first floor and a little way along a passage. The nurse had a large bunch of keys attached to her belt. She selected one, unlocked a door. They waited while she went inside. Leggett looked at Hartman, hoping for an explanation, but he wouldn't meet his eye. The nurse reappeared. "She's awake." It was a small room. The iron bedstead took up most of it. Her head was propped up on a pillow, a thick white nightgown buttoned to her throat. Leggett would never have recognized her. Her hair was cut mannishly short. Her face was much fatter, her skin waxy. But it was the lack of animation in her features, in her dark brown eyes especially, which rendered her a stranger. Hartman went forward and took her hand and kissed her forehead. He whispered something to her. She gave no sign of having heard. He said, "Hugh, why don't you come in and say hello?" With an effort, Leggett walked to the side of the bed and took her other hand. It was plump, cool, unresponsive. "Hello, Lena." Her head turned slightly. She looked up at him. For an instant her eyes narrowed a fraction, and it seemed to him that perhaps something moved there. But afterwards he was fairly sure he had imagined it. On the drive back to Munich, Hartman asked Leggett to light him a cigarette. He lit it, placed it between Hartman's lips, then took one for himself. His hand was trembling. "Are you going to tell me what happened to her?" Another silence. Eventually Hartman said, "I can tell you as much as I know, which isn't much. We split up after Munich, as you might expect, and I lost touch with her. She was too much for me. Apparently she went back to Berlin and started working for the communists more seriously. They had a newspaper. She was part of that. After the Nazis came to power, they banned it, but it carried on publishing underground. As I understand it, she was caught in a raid in 1935 and sent to Maragon, the women's camp. She was married by then to a fellow communist." "What happened to the husband?" "Dead. Killed fighting in Spain. After that, they let her out. Of course, she went straight back to the comrades. They caught her again. Only this time they discovered she was Jewish, and they were rougher, as you can see." Leggett felt sick. He crushed the cigarette between his fingers and threw it out of the car. "Her mother got in touch with me. She lives not far from here. She's a widow, used to be a teacher, no money. She'd heard I'd joined the party, wanted to see if I could use my influence to get her proper treatment. I did what I could, but it was hopeless. Her brain was much too badly damaged. All I could do was pay for the nursing home. It's not a bad place. Because of my position, they've agreed to overlook the fact that she is a Jewess. It was decent of you." "Decent?" Hartman laughed and shook his head. "Hardly." They drove on for a while without speaking. Leggett said, "They must have beaten her terribly." "They say she fell out of a third-floor window." "I'm sure she did, but not before they carved a Star of David into her back." "Could I have another cigarette?" Leggett lit one for him. "This is the thing, Hugh. This is what we could never grasp in Oxford, because it is beyond reason. It's not rational." He waved the cigarette as he spoke, his right hand on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "This is what I have learned these past 6 years, as opposed to what is taught in Oxford. The power of unreason. Everyone said, by everyone I mean people like me, we all said, 'Oh, he is a terrible fellow, Hitler, but he's not necessarily all bad. Look at his achievements. Put aside this awful medieval anti-Q stuff. It'll pass. But the point is, it won't pass. You can't isolate it from the rest. It's there in the mix. And if the anti-Semitism is evil, it's all evil. Because if they're capable of that, they are capable of anything. He took his eyes off the road just long enough to look at Leggett. His eyes were wet. "Do you see what I mean?" "Yes," said Leggett. "I do see. I see now exactly what you mean." And after that they didn't speak for half an hour. It was starting to get light. There was traffic at last. A bus, a flatbed truck, piled high with scrap metal. And along the railway track in the centre of the autobahn the first train of the morning was moving towards the city. They overtook it. Leggett could see passengers reading newspapers announcing the agreement. "So what will you do?" Hartmann was so absorbed in his thoughts he seemed at first not to have heard the question. "I don't know." He shrugged. "Carry on, presumably. I imagine this is how it must feel to realize one has an incurable disease. One knows the end is coming, but even so one can't do anything except keep on getting up each day. This morning, for example, I have to prepare a foreign press summary. I may well be required to present it to Hitler personally. I'm told he may have taken a shine to me. Can you believe it? It could be useful, couldn't it? To your cause? Could it? This is my dilemma. Am I right to continue to work for the regime in the hope that one day I can do some small thing to help sabotage it from within? Or should I simply blow my brains out? Oh, come on, Paul, this is too melodramatic. The former, it has to be. Of course, what I really ought to do is blow his brains out. But everything I am prevents me. And besides, the one sure consequence would be a bloodbath. Certainly all my family would be destroyed. So, in the end, one goes on in hope. What a terrible thing hope is. We'd all be so much better off without it. There's an Oxford paradox to end with. He had started checking the mirror again. Now I should drop you a few 100 meters away from your hotel, if you don't mind, in case Strumbannführer Sauer is watching. Can you find your way from here? This is the opposite end of a botanical garden we talked in yesterday. He pulled up outside a grand official building, a law court by the look of it, festooned with swastikas. At the end of the street, Leggett could see the twin domed towers of a Frauenkirche. Hartmann said, "Farewell, my dear Hugh. All is good between us. Whatever happens, we shall have the consolation of knowing that we tried." Leggett climbed out of the Mercedes. He closed the door behind him and turned to say goodbye, but it was too late. Hartmann was already moving off into the early morning traffic. He walked back towards his hotel in a trance. At the busy intersection between the Botanical Garden and Maximiliansplatz, he stepped off the curb without looking. The blast of a car horn and a scream of brakes shattered his reverie. He jumped back and raised his hands in apology. The driver swore and accelerated away. Leggett leaned against a lamppost and lowered his head and wept. By the time he reached the Regina Palast 5 minutes later, the big hotel was coming awake. He paused just inside the entrance, took out his handkerchief, blew his nose, and dabbed at his eyes. Cautiously he scanned the lobby. Guests were making their way down the stairs to the dining room. He could hear the clatter of breakfast being served. At the reception desk a family waited to check out. When he was sure there was no member of the British delegation to be seen, he launched himself across the foyer towards the elevators. He summoned a car. His aim was simply to get back to his hotel room without being noticed. But when the doors opened, he found himself confronted by the dandish figure of Sir Neville Henderson. The ambassador had his usual carnation buttonhole in place, the inevitable jade cigarette holder between his lips. He was carrying an elegant calfskin portmanteau. His face registered surprise. "Good morning, Leggett. I see you've been out and about." "Yes, Sir Neville. I felt the need for some fresh air." "Well, you need to get upstairs, quickly. The Prime Minister's asking for you. Ashton Watkins already on his way to the Prague with the checks, and I'm off to catch a plane with von Weizsäcker to Berlin." "Thank you for the warning, sir. Have a good trip." He pressed the button for the third floor. In the elevator mirror he performed a brief inspection. unshaven, crumpled, red-eyed. No wonder Henderson had been taken aback. He looked as if he'd spent the night on the tiles. He took off his hat and coat. The bell pinged. He squared his shoulders and emerged into the corridor. Outside the Prime Minister's suite, the Scotland Yard detective had resumed his former position. He raised his eyebrows at Leggett in a look of amused complicity, knocked on the door and opened it. "Found him, sir." "Good, send him in." Chamberlain was wearing a plaid dressing gown. His thin, bare feet protruded beneath a pair of striped pyjama bottoms. His unbrushed hair was tufted like the plumage of a grizzled bird. He was smoking a cigar. In his left hand he clutched a sheaf of papers. "Where's that copy of the Times with Herr Hitler's speech in it?" "I believe it's in your box, Prime Minister." "Oh, find it for me, would you?" Leggett put down his hat and coat on the nearest chair and took out his keys. The old man seemed full of the same purposeful energy Leggett had noticed in the garden of number 10. Nobody looking at him would dream he'd barely slept. He unlocked the box and sorted through the files until he found the copy of Tuesday's paper, the one he'd been reading at the Ritz while he was waiting for Pamela. The Prime Minister took it out of his hands and carried it over to the desk. He spread it out, put on his spectacles, and peered down at it. Without turning round, he said, "I had a word with Hitler last night. I asked if I might come and see him this morning before flying back to London." Leggett gaped at the Prime Minister's back. "And did he agree, sir?" "I like to think I've learned how to handle him. I deliberately put him on the spot. He couldn't really refuse." His head was nodding slowly as he ran his eye up and down the columns of type. "I must say that was a quite remarkably rude young man you brought to see me last night." Here it came, thought Leggett. He braced himself. "Yes, I'm sorry about that, sir. I take full responsibility." "Have you told anyone about it?" "No." "Good. Neither have I." The Prime Minister took off his spectacles, folded the paper and handed it back to Leggett. "I want you to take this to Strang and ask him to turn Herr Hitler's speech into a statement of intent. 2 or 3 paragraphs should be sufficient." Leggett's brain was normally sharp, but not now. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't quite follow." "On Monday night," said Chamberlain patiently, "in Berlin, Herr Hitler made a public declaration of his desire for a permanent peace between Germany and Great Britain once the Sudeten issue was settled. I would like to have this undertaking redrafted in the form of a joint statement on future Anglo-German relations, to which we can both put our names this morning. Off you go." Leggett closed the door quietly behind him. A joint statement? He'd never heard of such a thing. Strang's room, if he remembered rightly, was 3 along from the Prime Minister's. He knocked, but there was no reply. He tried again more loudly. After a while he heard someone coughing, and Strang opened the door. He was wearing a vest and long cotton underpants. Without his owlish spectacles, his face was 10 years younger. "Good heavens, Hugh! Is everything all right?" "I have a message from the Prime Minister. He wants you to draft a statement." "A statement? About what?" Strang yawned and put his hand to his mouth. "Excuse me. It took me a while to get off to sleep." "Oh, well, you'd better come in." The room was in darkness. Strang padded across to the window and pulled back the curtains. His sitting room was much smaller than the Prime Minister's. Through the connecting door, Leggett could see the unmade bed. Strang collected his spectacles from the nightstand and carefully put them on. He came back into the sitting room. Tell me this again." "The Prime Minister is going to have another meeting with Hitler this morning." "What?" "Apparently he asked him last night and Hitler agreed." "Does anyone know about this? The Foreign Secretary? The Cabinet?" "I don't know. I don't think so." "Good God!" "He wants to get Hitler to sign some kind of joint statement based on the speech he made in Berlin on Monday night." He gave Strang the newspaper. "Is this his underlining?" No, it's mine." Strang was so disconcerted, he seemed that until that moment to have entirely forgotten he was only wearing his underwear. He glanced down at his bare feet in surprise. "I suppose I ought to get dressed. Could you see if you could get us some coffee? And you'd better fetch Malkin." "What about Sir Horace Wilson?" Yes, I think so, don't you? Especially if he doesn't know anything about it either." He suddenly put his hands on either side of his head and stared at Leggett, his neat diplomatist's mind plainly appalled at this departure from orthodoxy. What is he playing at? He seems to regard the foreign policy of the British Empire as his personal fiefdom. What an extraordinary business! Hartmann parked the Mercedes at the back of a Führerbau and left the key in the ignition. He moved stiffly. His night of driving had left him dangerously exhausted, and this, he knew, was a day above all others when he would need to keep his wits about him. But he was glad to have done it. He might never get another chance to see her. The rear entrance was unlocked and unguarded. Wearily he climbed the service stairs to the first floor. A team of cleaners in army uniforms was sweeping the marble floors, emptying the ashtrays into paper sacks, collecting the dirty champagne flutes and beer bottles. He made his way to the conference office. 2 young SS adjutants were sprawled in armchairs, smoking, boots on the coffee table, flirting with a red-headed secretary who was on one of the sofas, her elegant legs tucked under her. Hartmann saluted. "Heil Hitler! I am Hartmann from the Foreign Ministry. I have to prepare the English-language press summary for the Führer." At the mention of the Führer, the 2 adjutants quickly stubbed out their cigarettes, stood and returned his salute. One of them pointed to the desk at the corner. "The material is there waiting for you, Herr Hartmann. The New York Times has just been telegraphed from Berlin." The sheaf of telegrams, as thick as his thumb, was in a wire basket. "Is there any chance of some coffee?" "Oh, of course, Herr Hartmann." He sat and pulled the basket towards him. The New York Times was on the top. The war for which Europe had been feverishly preparing was averted early this morning when the leading statesmen of Britain, France, Germany and Italy, meeting in Munich, reached an agreement to allow Reich troops to occupy predominantly German portions of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, to do this progressively over a 10-day period beginning tomorrow. Most of Chancellor Hitler's demands were met. Prime Minister Chamberlain, whose peace affairs were finally crowned with success, received the loudest applause of Munich's crowds. Beneath it was another story. Chamberlain, hero of Munich crowds. There were real cheers, like the kind one hears in an American football stadium, whenever the slim, black-coated Chamberlain, with a smile and a careful walk, came out. Hartmann thought it was exactly the sort of detail that would make Hitler furious. He took out his pen. He would put it first. Strang, shaved and fully dressed, was seated at the desk in his hotel sitting-room, writing in his small, neat hand on a sheet of Regina Palast notepaper. A litter of discarded drafts surrounded his feet. Malkin, a pad of paper on his knee, had pulled up a chair and was looking over his shoulder. Wilson sat on the end of a bed, studying the text of Hitler's speech in the Times. Leggett was pouring coffee. It was obvious by his initial, startled reaction that Wilson had not known what the Prime Minister had in mind either. But by now he discovered his usual equilibrium, and was attempting to make it sound as if the whole thing had been his idea. Wilson tapped his finger on the newsprint. "This is the crucial passage, surely, where Hitler talks about the Anglo-German naval agreement. I voluntarily renounced ever again entering upon a naval armaments competition in order to give the British Empire a feeling of security. Such an agreement is only morally justified if both nations promise one another solemnly never again to wage war against one another. Germany has this will." Strang grimaced. Leggett knew what he was thinking. In the Foreign Office they'd come to the view that the 1935 Anglo-German naval agreement, in which Germany undertook never to build a fleet greater in size than 35% of the Royal Navy, had been a mistake. Strang said, "Don't let's revisit the Anglo-German naval agreement, Sir Horace, whatever else we do." "Why not?" "Because it's pretty clear Hitler took it as a nod and a wink, but in return for his letting us have a navy 3 times the size of Germany's, we would let him have a free hand in Eastern Europe. That was when the rot started." He jotted down a sentence. "I suggest we leave that one out and just take the second part of his statement and tie it specifically to the deal over the Sudetenland. So it would read, We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. Malkin, the Foreign Office lawyer, sucked his breath through his teeth. I do hope the Prime Minister realises this has no legal force whatsoever. It's a declaration of goodwill, it's nothing more. Of course he'll be aware of that, he's not a fool. Strang resumed writing. After a couple of minutes he held up a sheet of paper. All right, I've done my best. Why don't you take it to him, Hugh? See what he thinks. Leggett went out into the corridor. Apart from the detective outside Chamberlain's suite, the only other person was a stout middle-aged chambermaid, wheeling her trolley full of cleaning equipment and fresh toiletries. He nodded to her as he passed and knocked on the Prime Minister's door. Come! A table for two had been laid at the centre of the drawing-room. Chamberlain was having breakfast. He was dressed in his usual suit and high-winged collar. Opposite him was Lord Dunglass. The Prime Minister was buttering a piece of toast. Excuse me, sir. Mr. Strang has written a draft. Let me see. Chamberlain put down his toast, donned his spectacles, and studied the document. Leggett risked a glance at Dunglass, who widened his eyes slightly. Leggett couldn't read what he was signalling. Amusement, concern, a warning, perhaps all three. Chamberlain frowned. Would you go and fetch Strang, please? Leggett returned to Strang's room. He wants to see you. God, is something the matter? He didn't say. Malkin said, Perhaps we all ought to go. They were as nervous as schoolboys summoned to see the headmaster. Would you care to come with us, Sir Horace? If you like. Wilson looked dubious. Although I'd caution you against trying to change his mind. Once he's set on a course, he'll never change it. Leggett followed the three men to the Prime Minister's suite. Mr. Strang, you've left out the Anglo-German naval agreement. Why? I'm not sure it's a thing to be proud of. On the contrary, it's exactly the type of agreement we should now try to reach with Germany. Chamberlain took out his pen and amended the draft. Also, I see you've put my name before his. That will never do. It should be the other way around. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister, have had a further meeting today. He circled the titles and drew an arrow. I want him to sign it first, so that the onus appears to be slightly more on him. Wilson cleared his throat. What if he refuses, Prime Minister? Why should he? These are his own public undertakings. If he declines to put his name to them, he'll only demonstrate that they were hollow all along. Even if he signs, Malkin said, it doesn't mean he's obliged to stick to any of them. The significance is intended to be symbolic, not legally binding. Chamberlain pushed back his chair and glanced around at the officials. He was clearly irritated by their failure to share his vision. Gentlemen, we have to rise to the level of events. Last night's agreement settles one local area of dispute only. We may be sure there will be others. I want him to commit himself now to peace and a process of consultation. There was silence. Strang tried again. But shouldn't we at least tell the French that you're planning to seek this direct agreement with Hitler? After all, Daladier is still in Munich. His hotel's nearby. I see no reason at all for saying anything whatsoever to the French. This is entirely between Hitler and me. He returned his attention to the draft. His pen made short, neat movements, deleting some words, inserting others. When he'd finished, he handed it to Leggett. Have it typed. 2 copies, one for him and one for me. I've arranged to see the Chancellor at 11. Make sure the car is available. Yes, Prime Minister. This will go to the Führerbau, presumably. No. I suggested we should have a private talk, man to man, no officials. I particularly didn't want a ribbon drop anywhere near it. Therefore he has invited me to his apartment. No officials? Repeated Wilson, shocked. Not even me? Not even you, Horace. But you can't go and see Hitler entirely alone. In that case, I'll just take Alec. He has no official standing. Exactly. Dunglass gave one of his lipless smiles. I'm a nobody. After Hartmann had finished writing the Press Digest, it had been typed up by the pretty young redhead on the Führer's special large print machine. 4 pages in all, a unanimous exclamation from around the world of relief that war had been averted, of hope that peace could now be made permanent, and of praise for Neville Chamberlain. In the latter regard, the Times of London was as usual the most effusive. Considering that if the negotiations had failed and war had broken out, Great Britain and Germany would inevitably have been the protagonists on opposite sides, the cheering and the hiles to the man whose action throughout this crisis has been single-mindedly and unchallengeably specific, must have seemed to have a clear intention. Checking through the pages, Hartmann was forced to concede that there was some truth in this. In the heart of the Third Reich, in the very cradle of National Socialism, a British Prime Minister had managed to engineer what was, in effect, a day-long demonstration for peace. That was quite an achievement. For the first time, Hartmann was almost prepared to allow himself a flicker of hope. Perhaps the Führer would be denied his war of conquest after all. He refolded the summary and wondered what he was supposed to do with it. He was too tired to go in search of someone who might know. The secretary had gone back to her flirtation with the 2 SS adjutants. Their inconsequential babble about movie stars and sportsmen was soothing. He felt his eyelids begin to droop. Soon he was asleep in the armchair. He was woken by a hand roughly shaking his shoulder. Schmidt was bending over him. The ministry's chief translator was red-faced, in his usual state of nervous agitation. "My God, Hartmann, what do you think you're doing? Where's the Press Digest?" "It's here. It's finished." "Oh, that's something. Heavens, look at the state you're in." "Well, it can't be helped. We need to get a move on." Hartmann hauled himself to his feet. Schmidt was already heading towards the door. He followed him out onto the first-floor landing and down the marble staircase. The building was empty and echoing like a mausoleum. He wanted to ask where they were going, but Schmidt was in too much of a hurry. Outside, soldiers were rolling up a red carpet. The French tricolour had already been taken down. A workman atop a ladder was just releasing the last corner of the Union Jack. It fell behind them softly, like a shroud. He climbed into the back of a limousine next to Schmidt, who had opened a black leather folder and was leafing through his notes. "Weizsäcker and Court have flown back to Berlin, so it's all down to you and me now. It seems like there may be trouble in Wilhelmstrasse. Did you hear?" "No. What?" "Weizsäcker's assistant, Frau Winter. Do you know who I mean? Apparently she was picked up by the Gestapo last night." The car swept round Karolinenplatz. Hartmann sat numb. It wasn't until they were passing the long pillared façade of a house of German art at the bottom of Prince Regentstrasse that the appalling realization came to him of where he was being taken. Carrying out the Prime Minister's instructions kept Leggett busy for more than an hour. He gave the draft declaration to Miss Anderson to type. He rescheduled their flight back to London from late morning to early afternoon. He spoke to the protocol department of the German Foreign Ministry to arrange transport to the Führer's apartment and afterwards to the airport. He called Oscar Cleverly in number 10 to inform him what was happening. The principal private secretary was in great good humour. "The atmosphere here couldn't be more positive. The press is in ecstatics. What time will you be back?" "Late afternoon, I should think. The PM is going to have a further private talk with Hitler this morning." "A further talk? Does Halifax know?" "I think Strang is briefing Cadogan now. The point is he's not taking any officials with him." "What? Good grief! What are they going to talk about?" Leggett, as ever conscious that the line was probably tapped, said guardedly, "Anglo-German relations, sir. I shall have to leave it there." He hung up and briefly closed his eyes. He rubbed his hand across his bristled chin. It was almost 30 hours since he had shaved. The office was quiet. Strang and Malkin were speaking to London on the telephones in their rooms. Joan had gone off with Wilson, who had some letters he wished to dictate. Miss Anderson had taken the typed drafts for approval by the Prime Minister. He walked along the corridor to his room. According to the alarm clock, it was a little after 10:30 a.m. The maid had already been in, the curtains were open, The bed had been smoothed. He went into the bathroom, undressed, and ran the shower. He turned his face to the jet of hot water and let it massage him for half a minute, and then his scalp and his shoulders. He soaped himself and rinsed away the suds, and by the time he stepped out of the cubicle he felt restored. He wiped a porthole in the mirror and shaved, quickly rather than carefully, skirting around the place where he had cut himself the previous morning. It was only after he had turned the taps off and was drying himself that he heard a noise from the bedroom. It was indistinct. He couldn't tell whether it came from a floorboard or a piece of furniture. He stopped and listened. He wrapped a towel round his waist and went into the other room, just in time to see the door being closed very carefully and quietly. He threw himself across the room and flung it open. A man was walking away at speed along the corridor. Leggett called after him, "Hey!" But he carried on walking and turned the corner. Leggett tried to run after him, but it was hard to move quickly with both hands holding the towel. By the time he reached the corner, the man was vanishing towards the rear staircase. Halfway along the corridor, he gave up the chase. He cursed himself. A terrible thought came to his mind. He walked back quickly towards his room. Malkin was just emerging from the office. He drew back in surprise. "Good Lord, Leggett!" "Sorry, sir." Leggett sidestepped him and went into the room and closed the door. The wardrobe was open, his suitcase upended on the bed. The desk drawer had been pulled out completely, and the book of tourist information was face down, open. For a few seconds he stared at it stupidly. The cover showed the hotel lit up at moonlight. "Welcome in Munich." He picked it up and flicked through, turned it upside down and shook it. Nothing. He felt a terrible, hollowing panic fill his stomach. He had been unforgivably careless, fatally careless. The towel dropped to the floor. Naked, he went over to the bedside table and picked up a telephone. How could he find Hartmann? He tried to think. Hadn't he said something about preparing a foreign press summary for Hitler? "Can I help you, Herr Leggett?" the operator said. "No, thank you." He replaced the receiver. As fast as he could, he dressed. A fresh shirt, his Balliol tie. Once again he found himself kicking on his shoes as he walked. He slipped on his jacket and went back out into the passage. He realized his hair was wet. He plastered it down as best he could, nodded to the detective, and knocked on the Prime Minister's door. "Come." Chamberlain was with Wilson, Strang, and Danglas. He was wearing his spectacles, studying the 2 copies of the draft declaration. He looked up briefly at Leggett. "Yes?" "Forgive me, Prime Minister, but I'd like to make a suggestion with regard to your visit to Hitler." "What?" "That I should accompany you." "No, that's quite impossible. I thought I made it clear. No officials." "I'm not proposing myself as an official, sir, but as a translator. I'm the only one of us who speaks German. I can make sure that your words are being accurately reported to Hitler, and his to you." "I hardly think that's necessary. Dr. Schmidt is very professional." He returned to his perusal of the document, and that might have been that, but Wilson spoke. "With respect, Prime Minister, remember what happened at Berchtesgaden, when Ribbentrop refused to give us a copy of Schmidt's notes of your first long private conversation with Hitler? To this day we don't have a full report of that. It would have been a great help to us if there had been a British translator present." Strang nodded his agreement. "That's certainly true. Chamberlain could be peevish when he felt he was being pressured, but it would threaten to change the whole tenor of the meeting. I want him to feel this is very much a personal conversation." He slipped the 2 copies of the declaration into his inside pocket. Wilson looked at Leggett and shrugged slightly. He had tried. A noise came from the window. Chamberlain's brow creased in puzzlement. "What is that sound?" Strang pulled back the curtain fractionally. "There's a huge crowd in the street, Prime Minister. They're calling for you." "Not again?" "You should go out onto the balcony and wave to them." "I don't think so." "You must. Hugh, open the window, will you?" Leggett undid the catch. In the garden opposite the hotel, and in both directions along the street, the crowd was even greater than it had been the previous day. As the spectators noticed the French windows opening, they began to roar, and when Leggett stood back to allow Chamberlain to step onto the small balcony, the din became tremendous. Chamberlain bowed modestly 3 or 4 times in each direction and waved. They started to chant his name. In the hotel suite, the 4 men listened. Strang said quietly, "Perhaps he's right. Perhaps this is the one moment when Hitler can be persuaded by sheer force of popular opinion to moderate his behaviour. You can't accuse the PM of lacking imagination, said Wilson, or courage. Even so, with great respect to Alec, I'd be happier if one of us was in there with him. After a couple of minutes, Chamberlain came back into the room. The adulation seemed to have energized him. His face glowed. His eyes were unnaturally bright. How very humbling! You see, gentlemen, it is the same in every country. Ordinary people the world over want nothing more than to live their lives in peace, to cherish their children and their families, and to enjoy the fruits that nature, art, and science have to offer them. That is what I wish to say to Hitler. He brooded for a moment, then turned to Wilson. Do you really think we can trust Schmidt? It's not Schmidt who concerns me, Prime Minister. It's Ribbentrop. Chamberlain thought it over. Oh, very well. But be discreet, he warned Leggett. Do not take notes. I only want you to intervene if my meaning is not being properly rendered, and make sure you keep out of his line of sight. Prince Regentenplatz had scarcely changed in the 6 years since Hartmann had last seen it. As they came up the hill and rounded the bend, his eyes went immediately to the spot in the north-east corner where he had stood with Hugh and Lena. On the pavement beneath a large white stone apartment building with a high red slate roof. A similar-sized crowd had gathered in the same place today, hoping for a glimpse of the leader. The Mercedes drew up outside number 16. A pair of SS sentries guarded the entrance. Seeing them, Hartmann realized he was still carrying his gun. He'd grown so used to its snug weight, he kept forgetting he even had it. He ought to have dumped it during the night. If they had picked up Frau Winter, he must surely be next. He wondered where they had arrested her, at the office or in her apartment, and how they were treating her. As he climbed out of the car after Schmidt, he could feel the sweat trickling beneath his shirt. The guards recognized Schmidt and waved him through, and Hartmann slipped in after him. He was not even asked his name. They passed another pair of SS men in the concierge's office and climbed the communal staircase. Stone at first, that became polished wood. The walls were tiled in institutional grey and green, as in a metro system. There were dim electric lamps, but the light came mostly from the landing windows that looked out onto a small rear garden of fir and silver birch trees. They clumped up noisily, past apartments on the ground and first floors. It was said by the propaganda ministry that the Führer still had the same neighbours as he did before he became Chancellor, proof that at heart he remained a simple member of the Volk. Perhaps it was true, thought Hartmann, in which case what strange goings-on these people must have seen over the past few years, from the death of Hitler's niece in 1931 to yesterday's lunchtime visit by Mussolini. They continued to climb. He felt trapped, as if he were being drawn relentlessly by some dark magnetic force. He slowed his pace. "Come on," said Schmidt. "Keep up." On the second floor, nothing distinguished the apartment's solid double door from the others. Schmidt knocked, and they were admitted by an SS adjutant into a long, narrow vestibule. It stretched away on either side, parquet floored with rugs, paintings, sculptures. The atmosphere was silent, unhomely, unlived in. The adjutant invited them to sit. "The Führer is not yet ready." He moved away. Schmidt whispered confidingly, "He keeps late hours. Often he does not emerge from his bedroom until noon." "You mean we might have to sit here another hour?" "Not today. Chamberlain is due at 11. Hartmann gave him a look of surprise. It was the first he knew that Hitler was meeting the British Prime Minister. It took Chamberlain's car several minutes to break free from the clutching hands of the crowd around the front of the hotel. The Prime Minister rode in the back with done glass. Leggett sat up front next to the driver. Behind them was a second Mercedes carrying the Prime Minister's 2 bodyguards. They made a partial circuit of the square and then sped off into Odeonsplatz, into a district of elaborate royal palaces and grand public buildings that Leggett vaguely remembered from 1932. He studied Chamberlain in the wing mirror, gazing rigidly ahead. People were shouting his name, waving at him. He sped on, oblivious. No longer the dry-as-dust administrator of popular legend, he'd become a seer, a messiah of peace, robed in the drab costume of an elderly accountant. They drove onto a bridge with a stone balustrade. The river was wide and green, the strip of trees along the embankment an advancing line of fire, red, gold, orange. The sun lit the gilded figure of the angel of peace, leaning forwards on top of her high stone column. Beyond the monument, the road looped through a park. They began to climb the slope of Prince Regent's Strasse. Leggett had always pictured it as steep, in the way that one misremembers scenes from childhood, but now, in a powerful car, it seemed no more than a gentle incline. They passed a theatre on the right, and suddenly they were in the space in front of Hitler's apartment. And this, at least, was exactly as he had carried it in his mind, right down to the crowd on the pavement, who recognised Chamberlain and started to cheer. Again, the Prime Minister, in his mystic state, didn't even glance across at them. The guards saluted, and an adjutant stepped forward to open the car door. Leggett let himself out and followed Chamberlain and Danglars through the entrance and up the steps into the gloomy interior. The adjutant ushered the Prime Minister into a small caged elevator and pressed the button, but it failed to move. He tried for another half-minute, his handsome young face turning blotchy with embarrassment. Finally he had to pull open the gate and indicate that they should proceed on foot. Leggett fell in beside Danglars as they climbed the stairs behind Chamberlain. Danglars whispered, "No ink last night. Hardly any telephones would work. I don't think these chaps are quite as efficient as they like to make out." Leggett was praying that Hartmann would be there. He was not sure what he could offer God in return, but it would be something, he promised him. A different life, a fresh start, a gesture equal to the age. They arrived at the second floor. The adjutant opened the door to the apartment, and there, mirabile dictu, was Hartmann, sitting with his long legs stretched out. Beside him, Leggett recognised Hitler's translator. They both stood when they saw Chamberlain. Hartmann stared at Leggett, but there was no opportunity for anything more than a glance to pass between them. The adjutant was insisting Leggett follow Chamberlain and Danglars across the hall and into the room opposite. He told Schmidt to come too. Hartmann made a move to accompany, but the adjutant shook his head. "Not you, wait here." For a few seconds Hartmann stood alone in the empty lobby. Leggett's brief glance had been full of warning. Something else must have happened. He wondered if he should slip away while he had the chance. Then he heard a door open to his right, and he turned to see Hitler emerging from a room at the far end of the corridor. He was smoothing his hair and straightening his brown party jacket, checking his armband, fussy last-minute adjustments, like an actor preparing to go on stage. Hartmann jumped to his feet and saluted. "Heil Hitler!" Hitler looked at him and raised his hand in absent-minded acknowledgment, but gave no sign of recognition. He stepped into the room in which the others were waiting, and the door was closed behind him. Afterwards, Leggett would be able to claim, not boast, that was never his style, that he had been in the same room as Hitler on 3 separate occasions, twice at the Führerbar and once in his apartment. But like most of the British eyewitnesses at Munich, he was never able to provide anything more than the most commonplace description. Hitler looked as he looked in the photographs and newsreels, except in colour, and the main shock of the encounter lay simply in finding oneself in proximity to a world-famous phenomenon, like seeing the Empire State Building or Red Square for the first time. One detail stuck in his mind, though. Hitler smelled strongly of sweat. He detected it in his study and caught a whiff of it now as he passed. He had the body odour of a front-line soldier or a workman who had not bathed or changed his shirt for a week. He was yet again in a dour mood and made no attempt to hide it. He stalked in, greeted Chamberlain, ignored everyone else, then went and sat in the furthest corner of the room and waited for his visitor to join him. The Prime Minister took the armchair to the right. Schmidt sat on the left. The adjutant stationed himself by the door. It was a big room, running almost the entire length of the apartment, looking out onto the street, and finished in modern style, like a salon aboard a luxury liner. There was a library alcove at the far end, crammed with books, where Hitler and Chamberlain were sitting, an area of sofas and chairs in the middle, where Leggett and Danglars had perched themselves, and a dining table at the opposite end. Leggett was close enough to hear what was said, but far enough distant not to impinge on the conversation. However, because Hitler was in the corner, it was impossible for him to obey the Prime Minister's instruction, and entirely escape the dictator's eye, and from time to time he noticed those strangely opaque blue eyes flicker in his direction, as if trying to work out why these two strangers were present in his flat. "First of all," Chamberlain said, "I would like to thank you, Chancellor, for inviting me to your home and for agreeing to hold one final conversation before I return to London." Schmidt translated faithfully. Hitler was sitting slightly propped forward by a cushion. He listened, nodded politely. "Ja, I thought we might briefly discuss some areas of mutual interest between our two countries on which we might be able to cooperate in the future." More nodding. "Ja." The Prime Minister reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small notepad. From his inside pocket he produced his fountain pen. Hitler watched him warily. Chamberlain opened the first page. "Perhaps we might begin with this terrible civil war in Spain." Almost all the talking was done by Chamberlain. Spain, Eastern Europe, trade, disarmament. He ticked off the list of topics he wished to raise, and to each Hitler responded briefly, without being drawn into detail. "That is a matter of vital interest to Germany," was the most he would say, or "our experts have made a study of the subject." He fidgeted in his chair, folded and refolded his arms, looked over at his adjutant. Leggett thought he was like a householder who had agreed in a moment of weakness to let a salesman or a religious proselytizer over the threshold, and bitterly regretted it, and was now looking for an opportunity to get rid of him. Leggett himself kept glancing at the floor, trying to calculate how he might be able to escape long enough to whisper a warning to Hartmann. Even Chamberlain seemed to detect that his audience was becoming distracted. He said, "I realize how busy you are. I must not detain you further. What I wish to say in conclusion is this. As I left London yesterday morning, women and children and even babies were being fitted with masks to protect them against the horrors of poison gas. I hope, Herr Chancellor, that you and I can agree that modern warfare, the brunt of which will be directed as never before against ordinary civilians, is abhorrent to all civilized nations." "Ja, ja." "I believe it would be a pity if my visit passed off with nothing more than the settlement of the Czech question. And in that spirit I've drafted a short statement putting on record our mutual desire to establish a new era in Anglo-German relations that may bring stability to the whole of Europe. I would like us both to sign it." Schmidt translated. When he came to the word statement, Leggett saw Hitler dart a look of suspicion at Chamberlain. The Prime Minister drew the two copies from his inside pocket. He handed one to Schmidt. "Perhaps you would be kind enough to translate this for the Chancellor." Schmidt glanced at it, and then began to read it out in German, carefully emphasizing every word. "We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister, have had a further meeting today, and we agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe." Hitler nodded slowly. "Ja, we regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again." At that, Hitler cocked his head slightly to one side. Clearly he'd recognized his own words. A slight frown appeared. Schmidt waited to be told to go on, but Hitler said nothing. In the end, the translator continued of his own accord. "We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries. And we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe." For several seconds after Schmidt had finished, Hitler didn't move. Leggett could see his gaze travelling round the room. A process of calculation was evidently underway. Presumably it was hard for him to refuse to sign sentiments which he himself had expressed in public. Yet it was also obvious he resented it. Resented this fussy old English gentleman tricking his way into his home and presenting him with this démarche. He suspected a trap. The English were cunning, after all. On the other hand, if he signed it, at least the meeting would be over and Chamberlain could clear out. And at the end it was only a scrap of paper, the expression of a pious hope without any legal consequence. What did it matter? This, or at any rate something like it, was what Leggett afterwards surmised must have gone through the dictator's mind. Ja, Schmidt translated. The Führer says yes, he will sign it. Chamberlain smiled with relief. Hitler clicked his fingers at the adjutant, who hastened towards him, pulling out a pen. Danglas stood to get a clearer view. Leggett saw his chance and walked over to the door. Hartmann had sat for 10 minutes in the deserted vestibule. The press summary lay on the chair beside him. To his left he could hear the faint sounds of plates clattering, a woman's voice, a door opening and closing. That, he guessed, must be the service area, the kitchen, cloakroom, servants' quarters. The Führer's bedroom must therefore be to the right. The door to the room where Chamberlain and Hitler were meeting was closed. He could hear nothing through the thick wood. Hanging next to it was a watercolour of a Vienna State Opera House, technically proficient, but stilted and soulless. He suspected it must be Hitler's own work. He rose and crossed the parquet floor to examine it. Yes, there were his initials in the bottom right-hand corner. Pretending to study the picture more closely, he glanced towards the Führer's bedroom in the shadows at the end of the passage. There was a room adjoining it, only 4 or 5 paces away. Curiosity overcame him. He looked towards the kitchen to check he was unobserved, then casually crossed to it and opened the door. It was a small bedroom looking out onto trees at the back garden. The Venetian blind was half down. There was a strong, sickly sweet scent of both dried and fresh flowers, and of dark cinnamon-like perfumes that had dehydrated in their bottles. On the dressing table were a vase of withered roses and a bowl of yellow and purple freesias. Draped across the bed was a simple white cotton nightdress, like the one Lena had been wearing. He walked to the end of the bed and opened the door to a bathroom. He could see, through the open door opposite to Hitler's bedroom, a jacket hanging on the back of a chair. As he retreated, he took a closer look at the dressing table. A framed black-and-white photograph of a dog, a pile of newspapers, a copy of a fashion magazine. He checked the date. September 1931. Lena had been right. Once one saw it, one could not doubt it. The proximity of a room to Hitler's, the unnatural, stifling closeness, the shared bathroom, the way it had been left as a shrine, like an Egyptian burial chamber. Behind him he heard a noise. He stepped back quickly and closed the door. Leggett was emerging from the drawing-room. After glancing over his shoulder, he said in a quick, quiet voice, "I'm afraid I have bad news. The Gestapo have the document." It took Hartmann a moment to adjust his mind. He looked past Leggett to the open doorway, but couldn't see anyone. He whispered, "When?" "Less than an hour ago. They searched my room while I was showering." "You're sure it's definitely gone?" "No question of it. Paul, I'm so very sorry." Hartmann held up his hand to silence him. He needed to think. If it's less than an hour, they must be looking for me. He stopped himself. The adjutant had appeared behind Leggett. He emerged from the drawing-room, followed by Chamberlain and Hitler. After them came Schmidt and Danglas. The Prime Minister was holding 2 small pieces of paper. He gave one to Hitler. "This is for you, Herr Chancellor." Hitler handed it immediately to the adjutant. Now that his visitors were leaving, he seemed more relaxed. He gave an order to Schmidt. "I will escort you back to your hotel, Prime Minister, and the Führer wishes you a pleasant flight." "Thank you." Chamberlain shook hands with Hitler. He looked as if he'd like to make a further short speech, but decided against it. The adjutant opened the front door, and the Prime Minister went out onto the landing with Schmidt. Danglas said, with an edge of sarcasm, "You coming, Hugh?" Leggett knew he would never see Hartmann again, but there was nothing he could say. He nodded to him and went out after the others. Once the door had closed, Hitler stood staring at it for several seconds. He He was rubbing the palm of his right hand with his left thumb, an unconscious action, round and round, as if he'd sprained it. Finally he noticed the press summary lying on the chair. He turned to Hartmann. "Is that what the foreign press are saying?" "Yes, my Führer. Bring it in here." Hartmann had been hoping to slip away. Instead he found himself following Hitler into the drawing room. The adjutant was straightening the furniture, smoothing the cushions. Hartmann handed over the press summary. Hitler fished in his breast pocket for his spectacles. From the street below came the sound of cheering. Glasses in one hand, he glanced at the window, then went over to it. He pulled back the edge of a net curtain and stared down at the crowd. He shook his head. "How can one make war with such a people?" Hartmann crossed to a different window. The crowd had grown much larger in the last half hour, once word had got out that Chamberlain was in the building. Several hundred people were lining the opposite pavement. The men were waving their hats, the women stretching out their arms. The angle made it impossible to see the Prime Minister's car, but one could tell its progress by the way people's heads turned to follow it as it drove by. Hitler dropped the curtain. "The German population has allowed itself to be duped, and by Chamberlain of all people." He shook out his spectacles and put them on one-handed. He began scanning the press summary. Hartmann was about to move away from the window when his eye was caught by fresh activity in the street. A big Mercedes limousine roared into view and pulled up sharply outside. Hartmann could make out Ribbentrop, and beside him Sauer. Plainly in a hurry, they jumped out and began crossing the road, looking right and left, even before their escort, a second Mercedes, carrying a quartet of SS men, had come to a stop. As Sauer waited for a truck to pass, he stared up at the apartment. Instinctively Hartmann drew back to avoid being seen. Hitler was flicking through the summary. In a mocking voice he read out the headlines in the New York Times. "Chamberlain, hero of Munich crowds. The cheers for Hitler were mechanical and polite, but for Chamberlain they were ecstatic." In the vestibule the entry bell rang. The adjutant left the room. Hitler threw the document onto the sofa and went over to his desk. For a second time Hartmann was left alone with him. He heard voices in the lobby. He slipped his hand inside his jacket. His fingertips touched metal. Yet immediately he withdrew it. It was absurd. He was about to be arrested, yet still he could not act. And if he couldn't do it, who could? In that moment, in a flash of clarity, he saw that nobody, not him, not the army, not a lone assassin, that no German would disrupt their common destiny until it was fulfilled. The door opened and Ribbentrop came in. Sauer was behind him. They stopped and saluted. Sauer gave Hartmann a look of violent hatred. Hartmann felt a roaring in his ears. He readied himself. Ribbentrop, however, seemed more nervous. "My Führer, I am told you have just seen Chamberlain." "He asked for a private meeting last night. I could not see harm in it." "May I ask what he wanted?" "For me to sign a piece of paper." Hitler picked it up from a desk and gave it to the foreign minister. "He seemed such a harmless old gentleman. I thought it would be rude to refuse." "Ha!" Ribbentrop's face appeared to tauten as he read it. Of course, the Führer could not have made an error. It would be unthinkable even to suggest it. But Hartmann could sense a change of atmosphere in the room. Eventually Hitler said irritably, "Oh, don't take it so seriously. That piece of paper is of no further significance whatsoever. The problem is here, with the German people." He turned his back on them and bent to examine the papers on his desk. Hartmann saw his chance. With a slight bow first to the foreign minister and then to Sauer, he withdrew towards the door. Neither attempted to stop him. A minute later he was out on the street. The Lockheed Electra was bucketing through the low cloud that covered the English Channel. Beyond the windows there was nothing to be seen except an infinity of grey. Leggett sat in the same rear seat he'd occupied on the flight to Munich, his chin in his hand, staring out at nothing. The Prime Minister was in the front with Wilson. Strang and Malkin were in the middle. Only Ashton Watkin was missing. He was still in Prague, selling the agreement for Czechs. The atmosphere on board was exhausted, melancholy. Malkin and Dunglass were asleep. There was a hamper of food in the locker behind Leggett's seat, provided by the Regina Palast Hotel, but when Chamberlain had been told it was a present from the Germans, he'd given orders it was not to be touched. It didn't matter. Nobody was hungry. Once again, Leggett could tell by the pressure in his ears when they were starting to descend. He took out his watch. It was just after 5. Wilson leaned out of his seat. "Hugh," he gestured to him to come forward. "Gentlemen, could we talk?" Leggett walked unsteadily to the front of the plane. Strang and Malkin shifted into the seats behind the Prime Minister. He and Dunglass had to stand with their backs to the cockpit. The plane lurched and they knocked into one another. Wilson said, "I've been speaking to Commander Robinson. We should be on the ground in about half an hour. Apparently there's quite a crowd waiting for us, as you might imagine. The King has sent the Lord Chamberlain to conduct the PM directly to Buckingham Palace, so that their Majesties can convey their thanks in person. There will be a meeting of the Cabinet as soon as we get back to Downing Street." The Prime Minister said, "Obviously I shall have to make a statement to the cameras." Strang cleared his throat. "May I say, Prime Minister, that I would urge you to treat any undertaking given by Hitler with the utmost caution. The actual agreement over the Sudetenland is one thing. Most people will understand the reasons for that. But this other document—" His voice trailed off. He was seated directly behind Chamberlain. His long face was anguished. The Prime Minister had to turn his head slightly to reply to him, and Leggett registered again how stubborn he was in profile. "I understand the Foreign Office point of view, William. I know Cadogan, for example, believes we should treat appeasement simply as a regrettable necessity. Make it clear we have no practical alternative as things stand. Use it purely as an opportunity to buy time and announce a massive programme of rearmament. Well, we are rearming massively. Next year alone we shall devote more than half of all government expenditure to arms." He now spoke to them all, particularly perhaps to Leggett, although he could never afterwards be sure. "I am not a pacifist. The main lesson I have learned in my dealings with Hitler is that one simply can't play poker with a gangster if one has no cards in one's hand. But if I speak in such terms when we land, that will simply give him the excuse to continue his belligerence. Whereas if he keeps his word, and I happen to believe he will, we will avoid war." Strang persisted. "But what if he breaks his word?" "If he breaks it? Well, then the world will see him for what he is. No one then can be in any doubt. He will unite the country and rally the Dominions in a way they simply are not at present. Who knows?" He permitted himself a slight smile. "Perhaps it will even bring the Americans in on our side." He patted his pocket. "Therefore I intend to give this joint declaration the maximum publicity as soon as we land in London." It was 5:38 p.m. when the Prime Minister's plane finally broke through the clouds and appeared above Heston Aerodrome. As the ground flickered into view, Leggett could see the traffic along the Great West Road. Cars were halted for more than a mile in either direction. It had been raining heavily. Headlights reflected off the wet tarmac. A vast swarm of people, thousands upon thousands of them, was clustered at the airport gates. The Lockheed roared low over the terminal building, dropping fast. He gripped the armrests. The wheels bounced on the grass runway a couple of times, then settled, and they lurched over the airfield at 100 miles an hour, sending up a spray of water on either side, then braking sharply before turning onto the concrete apron. The scene beyond the window in the autumn gloom was chaotic. Cameramen and newspaper reporters, airport workers, policemen, scores of Eton schoolboys, bizarre in their formal dress, cabinet ministers, MPs, diplomats, members of the public and the House of Lords, the Lord Mayor of London in his ceremonial chain. Even at a distance Leggett could make out the immensely tall figure of Lord Halifax in his bowler hat, standing like Don Quixote beside the diminutive Sancho Panza of Sir Alexander Cadogan. Sears was with them. Their umbrellas were furled. It must have stopped raining. There was only one car, a big old-fashioned Rolls-Royce, flying the Royal Standard. A man in overalls guided them onto their stand and signalled that the pilot could cut the engines. The propellers stuttered to a stop. The cockpit door opened. As before, when they landed in Munich, Commander Robinson stopped to exchange a few words with the Prime Minister, then came down the sloping aisle and opened the rear door. This time the gust of air that blew through the cabin was English, cold and wet. Leggett stayed in his seat as the Prime Minister went past. His jaw was clenched with tension. How odd that a man so fundamentally shy should thrust himself into public life and fight his way to the top. The breeze caught the door, flapping it shut, and Chamberlain had to fend it off with his elbow. He bent out his head and descended into a terrific din of clapping and cheering and shouting that seemed almost hysterical. Wilson stood in the aisle and held back the others until the Prime Minister had cleared the bottom of the steps. The moment of glory must have been the chief's alone. Only after Chamberlain had started moving along the receiving line, shaking hands, did Wilson venture out after him, followed by Strang, Malkin and Danglas. Leggett was the last to leave. The steps were slippery. The pilot caught his arm to steady him. In the damp blue twilight, the lights of the newsreel cameras were a brilliant white, like frozen lightning. Chamberlain finished greeting the dignitaries and turned to stand in front of a bank of a dozen microphones, crested with the names of their respective organisations. BBC, Movietone, CBS, Pathé. Leggett could not see his face, only his narrow back and sloping shoulders silhouetted against the glare. He waited for the cheering to subside, and his voice carried thin and clear in the wind. "There are only two things I want to say. First of all, I received a tremendous number of letters during all these anxious days, and so has my wife, letters of support and approval and gratitude, and I cannot tell you what an encouragement that has been to me. I want to thank the British people for what they have done." The crowd cheered again. Someone shouted, "What you have done!" Another called out, "Good old Chamberlain!" Next, I want to say that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. He held it aloft, flapping in the breeze. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. He was too vain to put on his spectacles. He had to hold it at arm's length to make it out. And that was Leggett's lasting image of the famous moment, carried, burned into the retina of his memory until the day of his death many years later, as an honoured public servant. The jagged black figure at the centre of a great bright light, his arm stretched out, like a man who had thrown himself onto an electrified fence. The second Lockheed came to land just as the Prime Minister was being driven away in the King's Rolls-Royce. As Chamberlain reached the airport gates, the distant applause of the well-wishers merged with the roar of aircraft engines. Sears said, "My goodness, would you listen to that? The roads are blocked all the way back into central London. You'd think we'd just won a war rather than avoided one. There were thousands gathering in the Mall when we left. Apparently the King and Queen intend to take him out onto the balcony. Here, let me carry that." He lifted one of the red boxes out of the aircraft hold. "So, how was it?" "Pretty ghastly, to be honest." They walked together across the apron towards the British Airways terminal. When they had gone about halfway, the newsreel lights were abruptly extinguished. In the sudden murk, the crowd gave a good-humoured collective groan. They began to drift towards the exit. Sears said, "There's a bus to ferry us all back to Downing Street. God knows how long it'll take." Inside the packed terminal, the Italian and French ambassadors were talking to the Lord Chancellor and the Minister of War. Sears went off to see about the bus. Leggett stayed behind to guard the red boxes. Exhausted, he sat down on a bench beneath a poster advertising flights to Stockholm. There was a telephone box by the customs desk. He wondered if he should call Pamela to let her know he'd landed, but the thought of her voice and her inevitable questions depressed him. Through the large plate-glass window he could see the straggle of passengers from the second Lockheed coming into the terminal. Sir Joseph Horner was between the two detectives. Joan was walking with Miss Anderson. She was carrying a suitcase in one hand and a portable typewriter in the other. She headed in his direction the moment she saw him. Mr. Leggett. Really, Joan, do call me Hugh, for goodness sake. Hugh, then. She sat down next to him and lit a cigarette. Well, that was thrilling. Was it? Yes, I'd say it was. She turned to face him and looked him up and down. Her gaze was frank. I wanted to catch you before we left for Munich, but you'd already taken off. I've got a tiny confession to make. And what is that? She was very pretty, but he wasn't in the mood for flirtation. Between you and me, Hugh, I am not altogether what I seem. No? No. In fact, I am something of a guardian angel. Now she was starting to get on his nerves. He looked around the terminal. The ambassadors were still talking to the ministers. Sears was in the telephone box, presumably trying to track down their bus. What on earth are you talking about? She hauled her suitcase up onto her lap. Colonel Mingus is my uncle. Well, the father of a second cousin, to be more precise about it, and he likes to give me the odd errand to run. The truth is, the reason I was sent to Munich, apart from my typing skills, which are exemplary, was to watch over you. She snapped the catches, opened the lid, and from beneath her neatly folded underwear extracted the memorandum. It was still in its original envelope. I took it from your room last night for safekeeping, after you went off with your friend. And really, Hugh, I like your name, by the way, it suits you. Really, Hugh, thank God I did. The fact of his continuing freedom was miraculous to Hartmann. That afternoon, as he left the Führerbau to be driven to the airport, and later, as he sat on board the Junkers passenger plane that had been chartered by the Foreign Ministry to fly them home, and especially that evening when he landed at Tempelhof, at each stage of his journey back to Berlin, he expected to be arrested. But there was no hand on the arm, no sudden confrontation by men in plain clothes. No, Herr Hartmann, will you come with us? Instead, he walked unmolested through the terminal building to the taxi rank. The city was full of Friday night revellers, enjoying the unexpected peace. He no longer felt the same contempt for them that he had in Munich. Each raised glass, each smile, each arm around a lover, he saw now as a gesture against the regime. The bell inside her apartment rang unanswered for a long time. He was on the point of giving up, but then he heard the sound of the lock turning and the door opened, and there she was. Later that night she said, "They will hang you one day. You know that, don't you?" They were lying at opposite ends of the bath, facing one another. She'd lit a candle. Through the open door came the sound of an illegal foreign radio station playing jazz. "What makes you say that?" "Because they told me so, just before they let me go. Stay away from him, Frau Winter. That is our advice to you. We know his type. He may think he has got away with it today, but we will catch him out eventually." They were perfectly polite about it. "What did you say?" "I thanked them for the warning." He laughed and stretched out his absurdly long legs. Water slopped onto the floor. He could feel her skin smooth against his. She was right. They were right. They would hang him one day. On 20th of August 1944, to be exact, in Plötzensee prison, at the end of a length of piano wire. He could sense his destiny, even if he could not be exact about it. But there was life to be lived before then, and a battle to fight, and a cause that was worth dying for. Leggett was finally sent home a little after 10 p.m. Cleverly had told him there was no need for him to wait until the end of the cabinet meeting. Sears would handle the boxes. He should take the weekend off. He walked from number 10 through streets that were filled with people celebrating. Fireworks were being set off here and there across the city. The flashes of rockets lit the sky. The upstairs windows were in darkness. The children must be asleep. He turned his key in the lock and set down his suitcase in the hall. He could see the light on in the sitting room. Pamela put aside her book as soon as he came in. "Darling!" She jumped up and threw her arms around him. For more than a minute they didn't speak. Finally she broke away and cupped his face in her hands. Her eyes searched his. She said, "I've missed you so much." "How are you? How are the children?" "Better for having you home." She started to unbutton his coat. He caught her hand, No, don't. I'm not staying. She took a step backwards. You have to go back to work? It was not a criticism. It sounded more like a hope. No, it's not work. I'll just go up and see the children. The house was so small, they shared a room. John had a bed, Diana was still in a cot. He never ceased to wonder at the quality of the silence when the children were asleep. By the glow of a landing light they lay unmoving in the semi-darkness, their mouths slightly open. He touched their hair. He wanted to kiss them, but didn't dare in case he woke them. From the top of a chest of drawers, the eyepieces of their gas masks watched him. Gently he closed the door. Pamela had her back to him when he came down into the sitting room. She turned, dry-eyed. Emotional scenes were never her style. He was thankful for that. How long will you be gone? I'll just stay at the club. I'll come back in the morning. We can talk then. I can change, you know, if you want me to. Everything has to change, Pamela. You, me, everything. I've been thinking I might resign from the service. And do what? You won't laugh? Try me. I thought on the flight back I might join the RAF. But I just heard Chamberlain on the wireless telling the crowd in Downing Street it was peace for our time. He shouldn't have done that. He regretted it the moment he said it. According to Dunglass, Mrs. Chamberlain had talked him into it. She was the one person he never could refuse. So you still think there'll be a war? I'm sure of it. Then what has all this been about? All this hope, this celebration? It's simply relief, and I don't blame people for it. When I look at the children, I feel it myself. But all that's happened really is that a tripwire has been laid down for the future, and Hitler will cross it sooner or later. He kissed her cheek. I'll see you in the morning. She didn't reply. He picked up his suitcase and went out into the night. Someone in Smith Square was letting off rockets. In the gardens he could hear cries of delight. The old buildings gleamed fitfully in the cascades of falling sparks, and then returned to darkness.